yes. So as promised, I'm Mary Dellenbaugh-Losse. I am originally from just around New York City, but I've been living in Germany for the last 14 years. I have a master's in landscape architecture and a PhD in human geography, and that will sort of lead into some of the work that I've been doing. Today, I'm going to be speaking about urban commons, which you may or may not have heard of. Some of this might be a little bit of a review for some of you. Let me just get to the screen and find the correct screen. There it is. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about urban commons, and I'm going to be speaking in particular about a book that I just put out. So I was lovely to hear about another person doing a labor of love book. So here it is. It's the Urban Commons Cookbook, and it's freely available as a PDF on my website. So you're welcome to download it. And if you want a physical copy, you can order one for €22. So just to cover the printing costs. So basically, maybe to just explain a little bit about my background, I did landscape architecture. I learned it at the Bauhaus here in Germany, and then when the sort of the upshot of that degree was that we were supposed to beautify the problems instead of getting rid of them, I decided that that was not the field for me, and went on to do a PhD, as I said, in critical human geography at the Humboldt University in Berlin. After a little bit of time in academia, I did end up going into NGOs, and I'm currently a freelancer and have been for the last 5 years, working almost exclusively for public bodies. So I do consulting regarding inclusive social design, public participation, and also integrate commons into that. So perhaps to just sort of go into how it all began. So it all began back in 2013 when I was just finishing up my PhD, and I was working with colleagues at the Georg Simme Center at the Humboldt University, and we put out a book called Urban Commons Moving Beyond State and Market, which was the first book about urban commons to come out on the market, where we really explored urban commons, which I'll explain in a moment, and commons from an urban lens. But this book was extremely academic, because that was the pair of glasses I had on at the time. And I felt this deep need to create something that was more aimed at practitioners. And that was how I came to the Urban Commons Cookbook, which I did together with 2 colleagues. And it's basically the first third of it is theory about commons and the urban aspects of commons. And then then we have interviews with 8 case studies, so different urban commons, and I'll be introducing those in the second half of my talk. And in the final piece, we have a range of tools. So we have a toolbox based on what the project said. So today, I'm going to sort of mirror that build. I'm going to talk about theory, what are urban commons. I'm going to talk about different types of commons, so common pool resources, which you may have heard of before, and Eleanor Ostrom, common property, and new commons. And then I'm going to reflect on Ostrom's 8 rules for cities. Then I'll get into the Urban Commons Cookbook in the second half of my talk, where I talk about the 8 case studies and what the similarities were, and go into 3 examples, and then finish with the take-home messages that we got from the projects. So for those of you who are not familiar with the term, urban commons are resources in the city which are managed by the users in a non-profit oriented and pro-social way. So this could be an urban gardening project, it could be municipal, a local community-led bike sharing, it could be infrastructure, water infrastructure or power infrastructure that's also done by a community-led group. Basically, the main characteristics of commons, it's defined by this process called commoning. So we talk about commoning, it's a verb, it's a doing things, because commons don't exist without commoning. And commoning is a collective participatory process for accessing, managing, and developing a resource, which is usually organized in an agile and flexible manner, though as we'll see, that really depends on what kind of resource it is and how big the group of users is. Now, urban commons are a special case because you have what's called congestion, which means you have high demand, which either leads to overuse in the terms of public goods or high prices in terms of consumer goods. Now, I just want to be clear that that public goods are not usually commons, although they can be commoned. So you can use this commoning process to manage public space, but it doesn't have to be. Finally, urban commons decommercialize resources. So they take resources out of the market and put the focus on the use value. So what value does this bike have to me because I can ride it, as opposed to the exchange value, which would be how much is someone willing to pay to ride this bicycle. So yeah, so by defining a resource as a commons, the commoners, so those people who take part in the commoning process, withdraw the resource from the market. And this can have very significant and positive effects on the accessibility of these resources. So that's really important, and it also reverses the logic of capitalism and the traditional state users. So users are decision makers in this process. So that means that commons, I'm sorry for the cheesy stock photo for commons, I can never find a good photo to demonstrate commoning. It's always something a bit hippy-dippy. So urban commons exist in this sometimes difficult area of tension between markets and the state, so between consumer goods and public goods. So public goods are owned and managed by the government, and consumer goods have access only to those who can afford them. So commons present an interesting niche outside of state and market structures. Of course, the ghost in the background is always this term enclosure. So enclosure means restricting access to a resource. And you could think of this in terms of privatization, financialization, takeover, or some other way of restricting access. So if you had free Wi-Fi and someone put a password on it, that's a form of enclosure. If you have a public space and you put a fence around it and have opening hours, that's a form of enclosure. It literally comes from the commons in feudal England, which were fenced in, so literally enclosed. And that's where the terminology comes from. So urban commons have three basic parts: people, resources, and commoning. So you have the users who also participate in this commoning process to manage the resource and negotiate the rules surrounding it. And you would think that these three things are sort of on equal footing, but actually they're not. So what we have is we have a resource with some sort of characteristics, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And the characteristics of the resource define the characteristics of how many people can use it and what management looks like. And that gives way to this sort of structure of a commons. And I'm going to get into some examples at the end of the talk in case this is a little too abstract for you. So if we think about the key aspects of urban commons, resources can be used up or not. So that means they're depletable. Access can be limited or not. So excludability. And also there's a term called rivalrous use. So does one user's use take away from others' enjoyment or ability to use the resource? So if we think about a classic common pool resource, fisheries, this was the beginning of Elinor Ostrom's work. It is depletable. So if you take a fish out, then there's one less fish, obviously. And it's non-excludable because you can't take all of the fish in the sea and put a fence around them. So this is a typical common pool resource. So when we talk about the people, the group of users and people who make a decision, we need to think, okay, so how many users are there for a sustainable use to get below, to keep the resource at a sustainable level, so keep it from going below a natural reproduction rate, in the example of fishes. Is the group open or is it closed? Is there an internal group for administration? Is there some group that makes decisions and other group who are just the users? And are there different roles within this structure? Finally, when we look at the process of negotiation, commoning, we think about how formal or informal is the management style. So if we have a wind park with over 8,000 users, then we need a very formal management style with bylaws, with terms of reference, etc. But if it's a small community garden with only 20 users, you can probably get by with just trust and handshakes until, of course, something unwanted happens. There's also the idea of how are decisions made? Are decisions made by vote? Are they made by consensus vote? Are they made by one person, one vote? Do we have, so that would be the cooperative model, or do we have, you vote with the number of shares that you have, which would be the non-cooperative model? And finally, how are rules enforced and violations punished? And we'll get right to this because that's also one of Elinor Ostrom's rules, is about sanctioning. But first I want to talk about different types of commons. So we have common pool resources, common property, and what's known as new commons, which are a bit fuzzy. So you can think about this as the hardcore are common pool resources. These are traditional commons such as ecological commons, fisheries, air quality, etc. So these are depletable and non-excludable. When we think about common property, we're thinking about commons-oriented or cooperative legal systems of property ownership and access. So these can traditionally be something like a housing co-op. And finally, and I'll get into new commons in a bit at the end of this, new commons are novel community-led projects, movements, and initiatives. For example, the Right to the City movement. So this is Elinor Ostrom, probably the coolest grandmother in the world. I wish she had been my grandmother. She has some really great ideas. And she worked out rules for managing common pool resources in 1990, for which she shared the Nobel Prize in economics. So these are really groundbreaking ideas. So the first idea, and like I said, she was looking in particular at fisheries. So if it helps you to have a concrete example, you can think about fisheries, because that's what she was basing this on. Number one, she said to define clear group boundaries. It makes you understand whether somebody is using the resource who's allowed to, and whether somebody who's not allowed to or not part of the group is free riding on your decisions. Match the rules governing the use of commons goods and to the local needs and conditions. So you really need not just a top-down way of doing rules, but also a bottom-up. So you have a two-way vertical understanding of the rules, the governance rules. You need to also ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying them. So this means that you have the users also co-deciding the rules, which is critical to commons. It's a fundamental part. You make sure that the rule-making rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. I don't know how much I can really stress this one, that it's really important that if a group of fisher people, fishermen, fisherwomen, have gotten together and gone through this commoning process, that their respective governments then respect that and recognize it. You need to develop a system, and here come the sanctions. Develop a system which is carried out by community members for monitoring members' behaviors and using graduated sanctions. So if somebody comes in, if we say, okay, Joe took too many fish, then the community says, okay, how can we monitor who has taken which fish, and how do we deal with punishing people who have taken too many fish or more than was agreed upon? Number 7, provide accessible low-cost means for dispute resolution. This means mediation, for example. So having the accessibility to mediation, because once you have a conflict in a commons, because commons are so based on trust, once you have a conflict in there, it's very easy for it to sort of fall apart like a house of cards, which can be quite an issue because if you don't have access to low-cost means for dispute resolution, you can really lose all of the work that was invested. And finally, you build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. So that means you start at a low level, one group of people fishing, and then you have their local municipality, their state, their national level, all the way up to perhaps an international level. So keep these in mind. We'll go back to them in a moment to think about them reflected through the eyes of the city or the lens of the city. But before we do that, I want to go into the other 2 types of commons. So common property is the formal or informal legal regime that allocates various forms of rights to a group. So, and Hess, Charlotte Hess, Ostrom's colleague, developed types of rights. So if you need an example for this one, we can think about open source software. So one of the rights is access. So do you have the right to enter a defined physical area or immaterial digital area and enjoy non-subtractive benefits? So can you simply access a resource? Are you allowed to contribute content to the resource? So can you write to the open source software? Can you extract? So can you download that software? Can you remove it? So can you take your code out of the software again? Do you have the right to manage or participate in the use patterns there? Do you have the right to exclude other people? Are you part of that group? And finally, do you have the right to sell or lease management and exclusion rights, which is quite tricky in terms of enclosure, as I said before. Moving to the third part of a third type of commons, Charlotte Hess defined something that she describes as new commons. And she says that these are various types of shared resources which have recently evolved or have been recognized as commons. And these are commons without pre-existing rules or clear institutional arrangements. However, she defines them as responses to increasing commercialization, privatization, and corporatization, as well as globalization and unresponsive governments. So we can think back to the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008. Self-help healthcare in Greece was an example of a new commons, for example. Or there are a range of other ones in our first book where we were talking about housing and foreclosure protection in Spain, for example. So many of the responses to the crisis of affordability would be understood as new commons. This can also include public resources which are redefined or rephrased as commons. So public space, sidewalks, understanding these things as commons, and so as something that should be accessible. Hess, this is the last list. Hess identified 6 common entry points for new commons. So, and I find this really fascinating because it defines a lot of the things that many social scientists and architects and other people working on cities have identified as commons. So the need to protect a shared resource from enclosure, privatization, or commodification, and this can also include fights against perceived gentrification or fights against new developments which are perceived as taking something from the community, taking a space. Or maybe it's a former commons project, such as an urban garden, which is then being replaced by a new tower, and the protests that then emerge from that. The observation or action of peer production and mass collaboration, primarily in electronic media. So this here very clearly open source software, Wikipedia, etc. Evidence of new types of tragedies of the commons, so enclosure and things being used up or overused, suddenly being conceptualized as a commons where they weren't before. The desire to build civic education and commons-like thinking, so that very much is part of our book. The identification of new or evolving types of commons within traditional commons, which I won't get into here, it's very complex, or the rediscovery of the commons. So if we think about these sort of three commons types and the city concretely, because I am an urban researcher. So if we think about common pool resources, these are depletable and non-excludable. The goal is the negotiation of sustainable and fair use. And we can think about this as open projects, open digital resources. I mean, many projects which involve excludable resources still choose to keep these open out of ethical or ideological reasons. So one of our examples was an urban garden in Düsseldorf, where they chose not to lock the gate. They have an ethical and moral compunction to keep the gate open because that's part of what they believe commons should be. Therefore, their project, although it's theoretically common property and could be excludable, they've chosen to keep it non-excludable. And this is very common for landed commons in cities, so land-based commons such as public space in between or open spaces in between housing cooperatives or urban gardens and the like. In terms of common property, these are excludable. This type of regulation and rules applies to excludable resources, which are usually also rivalrous use. So there are many different ways that you can use a piece of land in a city, of course, and so that's what it's talking about. You have a rivalrous use between these various uses for a piece of land. And the goal of common property regimes is the regulation of common rights. So how do you decide which rights exist, and how do you decide how open the project should be? So we can think, as I said, of landed commons such as housing co-ops, but also large infrastructure projects. Who gets the benefits? Who gets to buy shares? The rules surrounding who's eligible for shares, who's eligible to be on the board, these types of issues. And finally, we have new commons, which have a very large variety of characteristics. The theory is not very well developed on new commons yet, but the goal is often an emancipatory or a protest focus, a sudden realization or suddenly waking up that something is being enclosed which you didn't realize was a commons before. And this includes movements like the right to the city or no person is illegal. So if we think about Ostrom's rules for urban contexts, which become quite significant when you consider that many of the people working in urban commons projects are quite left-green political and therefore feel a moral compulsion to keep their project open and accessible, so non-excludable, then Ostrom's rules become quite central in this idea. So if we think about the definition of clear group boundaries, it's really quite challenging due to highly fluctuating urban populations. And we've got people moving in, moving out of neighborhoods where they may have been involved in projects. So it's quite difficult to define the clear group boundaries. When we talk about matching the rules governing the use of common goods to local needs and conditions, this is usually attainable from the side of the commoners, since urban commons projects are typically a direct reaction to a perceived need. So I mean, nobody makes a sort of community-led urban gardening project because the city council told them to. They do it because they enjoy it, they want to get their hands dirty, they want to learn about local food sourcing, they want to learn about heirloom tomato varieties, whatever it is. So this is actually quite easy to achieve. Ensure that those affected by the rules can participate in modifying the rules is also usually attainable, especially in cases where the clear group boundaries are possible and desired. So in the case of a housing co-op where people buy shares in order to become part of the cooperative, it's quite easy to then be able to say, okay, this group of 2,500 people are the ones who are allowed to make changes to the rules. Make sure that the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. This is frequently a problem, especially when projects come from an activist background. So it's quite difficult. Many city councils don't understand or don't recognize commons projects for what they are and for the benefits that they offer. So unless projects engage in lobby and public relations work, which was a central part of every project we interviewed, it's possible that the city administration may be fully unaware of the benefit that they bring to the city in terms of social capital, social cohesion, neighborhood feeling, placemaking, etc. The degree of formality for monitoring members' behavior, graduated sanctions, and dispute resolution is highly dependent on group size and composition. So in very small, informal projects, such as the urban garden with 20 people, it's not formal. It's not formal at all. It's all sort of a handshake and you know, how are we doing this? And oh, I heard he was picking tomatoes without us. How should we speak to him? That's usually not an issue because you have quite a large amount of social capital and social cohesion in these small groups. And I found that actually there's a sort of a natural breaking point known as Dunbar's number. It's about 150 people, and that's the number of people that a person can recognize and identify where they know them from. So you'll know this idea, you know this concept if you've ever seen someone in the supermarket and said, oh God, where do I know that person from? You can recognize their face, but you can't link it back to the association or where you know them from. So about 150 people is a good sort of rule of thumb for understanding when social controls and natural social norms become weaker and a more formalized management system is necessary. In larger and more formalized urban commons systems, such as the Mietshäuser-Syndikat, which I'll talk about in a moment, the development of nested tiers of commons resource governance have been established. So the Mietshäuser-Syndikat, the rental house syndicate from Germany, is it's a network of cooperative houses, typically political, and they are nested in tiers in local regions, and then they go all the way up to a super regional board. In general, rules and regulations will be more fluid and flexible for small groups, while larger groups will require more formalized structures to ensure transparency and fairness. And urban commons projects can fill needs that the cities have, so principle 2, but they often lack the recognition and support they require to scale up, principle 4. So getting to the end of the theory, just to sort of summarize that all, urban commons are resources in the city that are managed by the users in a nonprofit and pro-social manner. And the difference to other resource management structures is that they are managed through commoning, which is this collective participatory process for accessing, managing, and developing a resource, which is usually organized in an agile and flexible manner. You have the decommercialization, so emphasizing the use value over the exchange value and removing the resource from the market. And the end users have the power to make decisions. The resource properties are really decisive for group size and characteristics, as well as the management style, so the degree of formality, etc. And finally, urban commons are very diverse, and there are already many attempts to create common rules for their fair administration. Okay, I'm going to take a quick breath, like drink a little tea, and I'm going to move to our book. We had 8 case studies and really a wealth of similarities, which I'd like to go into now to make it really concrete for you. So we had, as I said, 8 case studies. The book is, as I've also said, freely downloadable as PDF, ebook on our website, or as a PDF on my website, and there's cross links as well. So Düsselgrün, the urban garden with 20 people I've been referencing in Düsseldorf, Freifunk, which is a wireless internet collective that are trying to spread free and open wireless across Germany and Austria. Incredible Edible Todmorden is a project from the UK where they do permaculture on public land to grow food. Bike Kitchen Bratislava I'll be speaking about in just a moment. It's a bike cooperative, a shared bike cooperative. Holzmarkt is an urban village here in Berlin, which I'll also be going into. Mittelgrunden Wind Energy Cooperative is the large wind farm I spoke about earlier with 8,552 shareholders. And that's just outside of Copenhagen. Club Cultural Matienzo, located in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, is a cultural club that came about after a terrible nightclub fire in that country. And Kalkbreite, which is a housing cooperative in Zurich, in Switzerland. So I'll just have 3 examples. I brought 3 examples tonight, or today, this morning, depending on where you are on the globe. So I want to speak to you about Bike Kitchen Bratislava in Slovakia. So it's a community bike rental known as the White Bikes. They also have a self-help workshop. They run events, and they do political campaigning for cycling. So they really do a lot of different things. Looking in particular at their integration of digital tools. So they use digital tools such as Google Docs to make sure that people who can't be at meetings can still read along what's being written and add comments. They also use an open source software, which is freely available on GitHub for their community bike rental. It's a really amazing system because they use a credit system. So the credit system, you start with 20 credits, let's say, and every time you use a bike, they remove 1 credit. And every time you, for example, clean or repair a bike or bring it from somewhere far away back to the center of the city, you get a credit. So, and if you help the bike kitchen, you get 1 credit. If you don't lock up the bike properly, you get demoted, they take away 1 credit. So it's a really interesting system, and it's based on this GitHub open source software that they developed. In addition, when you sign up for the White Bikes, you get a short primer on how to use them, and each user must indicate skills or support which they could offer to the entire group. So I thought it was funny, the person that I interviewed said, you know, some people say I can't do anything, and he says, well, you can pick up the beer for the party, or do you have a driver's license, or maybe you can help us clean up at the end of the day. Everyone can do something. But in particular, they have a database where they have graphic designers, they have web designers, they've got architects, they've got political lobbyists, so they really can pull on a large number of volunteers who also benefit, of course, because of the White Bikes. program. Moving to Holzmarkt, so this is one of the most sort of contentious issues, of course, urban development as a cooperative. And this is also quite a contentious program here in Berlin, simply because there's a bit of a David and Goliath fight going on here, and it's been going on for quite some time. So because the Holzmarkt involves land and development and a whole number of users and also some people with a vision and also a foundation that's helping them, it has a very complex and very formalized structure, which is made up of 2 cooperatives and a citizens organization, and it's super formalized. So the cooperatives, the board members of one cooperative sit in the board of the other cooperative and vice versa, and it's super complex, very legally formal. The cooperatives also cooperated with the Abendrot Foundation, which helped, it's a Swiss pension fund, which helped them to gain the access to the property. And also, because of having this strong partner, they were able to get the trust of the banks and the city as well. And they were able to be seen as serious. They have the rule in their meetings that one person alone cannot block a resolution. So if your idea is that great, you should be able to convince one other person at least. And in their actual construction process, they use an iterative process that uses interim uses such as raves, parties, restaurants, grilling, a lot of things we can't do right now, as a funding opportunity for longer term developments. And this is something that is sort of in their DNA, because the people who had the vision for Holzmarkt were from this 80s, 90s club culture that was very grassroots, very bottom up, and very interim, using in particular abandoned industrial spaces here in Berlin for parties. Finally, the Kalkbreite, it's sort of in between the two. And so they had a participatory approach right from the start, which decoupled planning and the right to an apartment. So the Kalkbreite is a housing cooperative built on land owned by the city, and it's in a long-term lease of 60 years, in which they pay the city 2% of the value of the land per year. And the city maintains the ownership of the land, and the cooperative has the ownership of the building. And this building is built above a tram depot, so a streetcar parking lot, you could call it. So it was quite a technical feat, and they used a participatory approach. So they said, okay, the first 20 hours that you contribute to planning are voluntary, and from the 21st hour upwards, we're going to pay you a certain number of Swiss francs per hour so that you can't sue us for the right to an apartment. And people got a little money. It was also quite nice. It was below minimum wage, so it was only a small gesture, but it was a gesture to say, just because you take part in the planning doesn't mean you have the right to an apartment, since more people contributed to the planning as there were apartments available. They've come up with, it's a very creative architectural design, and they've come up with a number of creative solutions that were in line with their own ethical stance. So for example, in terms of parking spaces, they make every person who moves into the apartment sign a voluntary declaration not to have a car, because that's their socio-ecological ethical view. So that because they do that, they didn't have to build parking as you would normally do when you build new construction. You have to build a certain number of parking spots for a certain number of apartments. They have also a really creative architectural feature called the Wohnjoker, or the living joker, which is a single room with a bathroom, which can be attached to any apartment for a period of up to 3 years in case living situations change. So in case you have to take care of an elderly relative, or in case the couple breaks up and it's a transition before the one or other partner finds their own apartment, this is the ability that, so you have, it's not its own apartment, but it has its own toilet and sink and shower, and then it's understood that it's attached to the other apartment. They also, the average living space in Zurich is 39 square meters, so just about 400 square feet per person. At the Kalkbreite, they reduced it to 31.2 square meters per person, so about 320 square feet. And in addition to their individual rent, they each contribute the costs to support 0.8 square meters, so about 10 square feet of common space. And common spaces in the building include the cafeteria, the saunas, because what would Switzerland be without saunas? They also have 4 rooms that they collectively decide on the use of. There's one that's a gym, there's one that's a sewing and knitting room, and then they have a youth room, and I don't remember what the 4th one is. And also what's really interesting is they have a collective choice about the demographic distribution of residents. So the residents, they've decided, should reflect the overall demographic distribution in Switzerland and not just be academic heterosexual Swiss couples. So when my interview's partners, his neighbor moved out, they were looking for a single elderly Swiss man without a university degree, and they found him, and his name was Hans. I think that was my favorite quote from that entire interview. They also have a solidarity fund, so the Kalkbreite saves up money into a solidarity fund in case any of the renters fall behind on their rent or have some sort of hardship, that their rent can be paid for a certain amount of time. And finally, decisions are based on systematic consensus. That means that that consensus is based on how much you disagree with an idea, not how much you agree with it, and you rank things 0 to 10. So 0 being, I have no resistance to this idea, and 10 being, oh my God, please never do this. So it gives you a more nuanced idea about how decision making can happen and how people really feel about these ideas. I'm just going to wrap up my talk with the 8 key takeaways. See, I thought I wasn't going to be able to fill 45 minutes, and what do you know? I've still got it. So the 8 key takeaways from our book, which were summed up from our 8 interviews. So cooperation can be a boon, but you need to work out the framework for cooperation clearly. So the wind park cooperated with the local energy company, but it was really important for them to say, what are the clear definition of this? And it was also quite a boon to them, so quite good for them, because in the event that they hadn't gotten the number of shareholders they needed, the local energy company was prepared to take over more wind turbines than the 50% that was originally decided upon. So this support from larger partners in particular can be really important with transition and scaling in terms of balancing risks. So for example, with this large investment, but it's very important to specify the conditions for cooperation in order to avoid potential risks of enclosure. Mission statements and manifestos can be really important, but they shouldn't become a straitjacket. So many projects start their projects by elaborating some sort of a mission statement or a manifesto or an ethical statement. And this can really help to get everyone on the same page. And it can be especially important for very large groups where the informal control mechanisms are weak, but it can become obsolete quickly. So it's very important to just maintain flexibility in daily work, particularly with smaller groups. And yeah, I mean, each of the projects we spoke to said that they did have this sort of a manifesto, but yeah, it's years old and it really needs to be updated, but we've just continued working and it's worked for us. Common opponents or problems can help with consolidation, but they can also become an obstacle. So it's some sort of something to fight against, a Goliath to fight against, can be a really good motivator for immediate action and continued support of your project. But it's really important, and Holzmarkt said this, that you should concentrate on what you're for, not just what you're against. Because if you're going to get the wider community involved in your project, you need to demonstrate that you're not just anti, but you're also pro, so you're for a particular idea. Team up with like-minded people and make good use of role differentiation and cooperation. So team up with other commons projects in the same topic. Düsselgrün, for example, cooperates with an organic farm and also with a beekeepers union. This can also help to increase the impact of collective action and sharing resources and skills, which helps to strengthen each other and also build synergies. Scaling, relocation, and transformation is a stress test. Change management, it's an issue. But these growing pains can really show you where improvements or adjustments could be helpful or necessary. So pay attention to this. Make sure that you build in time to deal with your change management if you are scaling up. A differentiated media presence can promote a broader visibility, and this can also act as a first step towards political lobbying, raising awareness and visibility. So making sure that your city council knows that you exist. And using differentiated media channels, and several of the projects said this, so both local newspapers and Facebook, for example, and adapting the language to different audiences can mean that you don't just reach millennials, but you also reach baby boomers, to use the American terminology or the US terminology. Align structures to the real solution, even if the real situation, even if the situation changes. So make the organization about the people instead of forcing people to conform to your organization. It sounds logical, but it can also mean more work. And commoning is a long process that involves a lot of talking, a lot of negotiation, and it takes longer than just managing things from top down, but it's very, very worthwhile. And finally, despite all of these guidelines, it should be fun too. It should be fun because people's passion will keep the project going when it's faced with challenges such as growing pains. If you make the process enjoyable and you use people's enthusiasm as sort of a springboard, then you can really overcome those challenges. Okay, so I'm going to open up the floor to questions, and I'll just put that on there. So at this website, www.urban-policy.com, you can download the book if you're interested, or order a copy. So I'm going to move back to the center here.
Thank you very much, Mary.
Yeah.
It was great.
Oh.
Really lovely. So yeah, if there are questions from the audience, please yeah, or write it in the comment, or just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Juliana. Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your research. I'm definitely going to recommend the Urban Commons Cookbook to friends who are involved in intentional communities or other kinds of projects. I think it really goes beyond urban even, and could be used for all types of community-based projects. But I was curious about some of the decision-making styles that you talked about, the cooperative versus the non-cooperative, and what you found, if there were any common themes of what seemed to work best, what was most effective, or if it was really dependent on what type of organization you're talking about. But I learned a little bit about sociocracy. I think it's also called holacracy as a decision-making style, and that sounded a little bit similar to some of the participatory approaches that you were talking about with the consensus -1, or not having one person block a decision. So yeah, I was just curious if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, sure. So in our research, we discovered that, and we compared and contrasted consensus-based decision-making and majoritarian-based decision-making. So vote up or down as majoritarian. You're either for it or against it, it's binary, or sort of a gradated understanding of whether you're for or against something as being this consensus, this systematic consensus model. And what we discovered was that it actually is more about the decision that needs to be made, and there were pros and cons to both, and we found that actually the projects alternate between systematic consensus and majoritarian votes depending on the topic that they're talking about. So things which are not controversial typically go through with majoritarian topics, but topics which are quite nuanced, such as deciding between many different options which have pros and cons, typically are dealt with through a systematic consensus model. We didn't look at sociocracy, but we had to draw the line somewhere. The book ended up being three years of freelance, essentially pro bono work, and almost 300 pages. So at some point we had to say, okay, we'll leave some topics for other people.
I definitely understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm seeing some other questions here. And so, so the question is, the idea of cooperation is explicit and intentional cooperation. So the scale of projects are punctual or very local with the idea of local nets. Yes, that is possible. And so we've got, I'm talking for a very long time. So you typically have, exactly, so local projects which are then networked at higher levels. And this would also be this incorporation of Ostrom's idea of nested tiers of agency. And so I think that explains the question, but if you have another question, just throw it in the chat. Graham, the size of the community at 150 people, it is possible to have more than that, but once you hit sort of, and this is really just a very rough and ready rule of 150 people, once you hit 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people, you need quite structured and formalized rules for structuring who does what when, how are sanctions levied, how do you deal with free riders, etc. How does voting happen, how are rules made? So below, I would say, just as a very rough and ready rule, below 150 people, you can have sort of trust-based decision-making, handshakes, things not quite as formalized. And above that, when you get into multiple hundreds of people, then you need bylaws in terms of reference and voting and, I don't know, liquid democracy if you're into that. So that's that. And yeah, I mean, land is obviously one of the central issues, and whether people decide to treat land as an excludable resource or a non-excludable resource means that that can be quite different in the way that things are managed and the rules and regulations that you want to pull in. So if you have a landed resource which is just open and available to the public, the Commons project, for example, in Holzmarkt, they had a security guard. They had just to make sure that nothing illegal happened on their property, because they're liable for it, of course. And also they had a cleanup crew, because they had a lot of trash being left at the site, people leaving cigarette butts, beer bottles, and the like, because it's a really nice location directly on the river. And it's quite a natural location as well.